the autumn of 1987, a Prime Minister sat down for an interview with Woman's Own, a magazine most of the country associated with recipes and knitting patterns, and somewhere in the middle of a long and deliberate answer, she used a form of words that would outlast almost everything else she ever said. There is no such thing as society. 7 words, they travelled faster than any law she ever passed. Within hours, they had been cut loose from the sentence that held them and set free as proof of what her enemies had always insisted, that behind the handbag and the certainty was a woman who did not believe in kindness at all. Soon after, she tried to set the words back in their frame. She explained that they came from an answer running to more than 1,000 words, that she had gone on to speak about families and neighbours and the obligations people owed one another. It made no difference. The correction came too late and reached too few. The 7 words had already set hard into the epitaph the country intended to carve for her. Now look at the Britain she left behind, 39 years on. 8.5 million people living alone, close to 1 household in every 3. Almost half of all adults reporting that they feel lonely.
I can go for days, at least, a few days, without speaking to anybody.
More than 9 million working-age men and women outside the labour market altogether. And of those, 2.8 million signed off on long-term sickness. Hospital waiting lists standing at more than 7 million. And here is the detail that ought to stop you. When researchers in 2025 finally put the whole 1,000 words in front of the public, the part nobody had ever read, close to half of those asked found themselves agreeing with her. Some of what Margaret Thatcher said about this country turned out to be prophecy. Some of it she made come true simply by saying it. And some of it was wrong on a scale that is still being measured. The problem is telling which is which. And to do that, you have to go back to the country that made her, long before anyone had heard her name. In July 1945, the British people voted out the man who had won them the war. Winston Churchill and his Conservatives were swept aside by Clement Attlee's Labour Party in a landslide that shocked the world. 6 years of fighting had ended in victory, and the victory had left the country hollow. Britain emerged from the war owing more than any nation in recorded history, £3.5 billion and more to the United States alone. 2/5 of the merchant fleet lay on the floor of the Atlantic. The bomb sites had not been cleared. Rationing was tighter than at any point during the fighting itself, and would grind on for another 9 years after the guns fell silent. For 6 years, the country had been told the state would feed it, house it, clothe it, and decide where its people worked and what they ate. The state was the machine that had won the war. The same machine, the voters reasoned, could surely win the peace. And so it set about trying. Attlee's government took the Bank of England into public ownership in 1946. Coal, the railways, gas, electricity, iron and steel, all of it nationalised by 1951. The National Health Service opened its doors in July 1948. The welfare state, in the shape the country still half remembers, was built in 6 years flat. To most people it looked like a miracle made solid. To a small number it looked like something else, a set of promises that could never be paid for, a set of industries that would never again be made to work, and a settlement that, once poured, would never be broken up. One of those people was reading the results in a grocer's shop in Grantham in Lincolnshire. His name was Alfred Roberts. He was a grocer, a Methodist lay preacher, and in time the mayor of his town, and his creed was as plain as a shop ledger. You earned what you had. You kept what you earned, and nobody was owed a single thing they had not worked for. His daughter Margaret was 19, and she lived in the flat above the shop, a flat with no hot water, no bathroom indoors, and no heating to speak of. She watched her father read those results and took from them a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. That the majority could be wrong. That to stand alone against the whole tide of opinion was not stubbornness. It was conviction. She won her place at Oxford to read chemistry a discipline that trains the mind to look past the surface of a thing and find the order underneath. It was, as it turned out, exactly the training the woman she would become required. Her convictions came with a shop floor certainty. The framework arrived later, and from 3 directions. From Friedrich Hayek, she took the warning that every step towards the state controlling more was a step down a road that ended in tyranny. From Milton Friedman, she took the tool she would actually use, the belief that if you controlled the supply of money and stopped propping up the industries the market had already condemned, the rest would follow. And in October 1974, after Edward Heath had led the Conservatives to yet another defeat, a man named Keith Joseph delivered a speech that amounted to a confession on behalf of his party. The Conservatives, he said, had spent 30 years governing as a gentler kind of socialist, and he for one was finished with it. That same year, Joseph and Thatcher founded the Centre for Policy Studies, an engine built to take the post-war settlement apart from inside the Conservative Party itself. She had already served her apprenticeship in being hated. Her first cabinet post, Education Secretary in 1970, handed her the lesson she would lean on for the rest of her career. Looking for savings inside her department, she ended free school milk for children over the age of 7. The country christened her Thatcher, Milk Snatcher. The newspapers declared her the most unpopular woman in Britain. She did not retreat an inch, and she took from it something she never forgot, that you could be the most loathed person in the country on a Tuesday and still be on your feet on Wednesday morning. The milk, in time, would look like the smallest administrative footnote imaginable, because what was coming next was not a policy dispute. It was a question about who actually governed Britain. And when that question was first asked, it was not Margaret Thatcher who had to answer it. It was the man she would replace. To understand what she spent the next decade preparing for, you have to understand what the miners did to Edward Heath. Arthur Scargill was 34, born in Worsbrough Dale, near Barnsley, the son of a miner. He left school at 15 for the coalface at Woolly Colliery, and at 17 he joined the Young Communist League. To Scargill, mining and politics were never two subjects. They were one, and that one subject was power, who held it and who did not. In January 1972, the miners walked out, the first national coal strike since 1926. The pressure point was a fuel depot at Saltley Gate, in Birmingham, still open, still moving coke. If the lorries kept rolling, the strike could be broken. Scargill answered with something the country had not seen before: flying pickets, miners driven through the night from Yorkshire and Durham and South Wales, so that by morning 15,000 men stood massed at the gates. The chief constable, facing that wall of people, closed the depot rather than risk what might happen if he did not. The strike was won, and Arthur Scargill became a national figure between dawn and lunchtime. On the Conservative backbenches, a woman was watching. She did not note the tactic. She noted the man. 2 years later, the miners struck again. The lights went down. Industry was rationed to 3 days a week. Heath cornered, called a snap election, and put a single question to the country: who governs Britain? On the 28th of February 1974, the country gave him its answer, and the answer was not him. Every sensible Conservative drew the same conclusion. You could not fight the unions. You accommodated them, negotiated, gave a little to keep the peace. Thatcher drew the opposite conclusion, and she drew it coldly. Heath had improvised, and Scargill had executed a plan. She would not improvise. In February 1975, she stood against her own leader. The first ballot came in at Thatcher 130, Heath 119. Heath withdrew. She took the second ballot with 146 votes and the leadership of her party. She did not celebrate where anyone could see her. She went away and began to have work done. By the time she held the leadership, the country waiting for her was no longer the tired, hopeful place her father had read those results in. Inflation had touched close to 25%. The pound had shed a third of its value against the dollar inside 18 months. In 1979 alone, 29 million working days would be lost to strikes. In December 1976, James Callaghan's government had been forced to sign a letter to the International Monetary Fund begging for a loan of $3.9 billion, the largest any country had ever asked of the fund up to that day. The Wall Street Journal summed up how the world now saw the country in 3 flat words. Goodbye, Great Britain. 2 winters later came the Winter of Discontent. Rubbish uncollected in the streets, the dead in Liverpool left unburied, schools shut, hospitals running on skeleton cover. In private, Heath had told colleagues he might turn out to be the last Prime Minister Britain ever had, because the country had drifted past the point where it could be governed at all. This was the patient Margaret Thatcher had been studying. This was the diagnosis she had spent years refining. And this was the moment it stopped sounding like ideology and started sounding like an emergency. Her reading of the sickness went further than the numbers. She had come to believe the rot was not financial, but cultural. A whole generation, she argued, was being raised to treat obligations as optional and entitlements as bottomless. A state that stepped in to solve every problem would, sooner or later, be asked to solve every problem there was. A society that shielded people from the results of their own choices would, in the end, produce people who had never learned how to choose. In a speech in 1976, 3 years before she reached Downing Street, she reached back to ancient Athens for the warning. A people who came in the end to want security and comfort more than they wanted freedom, and who, wanting those things more, lost all 3. It is an argument that reads very differently depending on which Britain you are standing in when you hear it. And if this is already the sort of story you find yourself leaning into, stay with it, because the channel is built on exactly these questions, and there is a great deal more of it waiting for you. Because in the spring of 1982, 3,000 miles to the south, an Argentine flag went up over a British colony almost nobody could have found on a map, the Falkland Islands. 1,800 British citizens, a garrison of 68 Royal Marines, overwhelmed in a matter of hours. The junta in Buenos Aires had made a calculation. London was too broke and too weary to fight a war over a scattering of rock in the South Atlantic. They had calculated wrong. Thatcher sent a task force of 127 ships and 25,000 men south to take the islands back. 74 days later, on the 14th of June, the Argentine garrison at Port Stanley surrendered. 255 British servicemen were dead, 649 Argentines. In January that year, her approval rating had sat at 25%, lower than any prime minister in the history of polling, and her own cabinet had been quietly discussing whether she could survive to the next election. By July, it stood at 59. The Iron Lady stopped being a jibe from the press and became a plain description. And in the general election of 1983, a year on from the surrender, she won a majority of 144 seats, the largest a Conservative had taken since 1935. She now had 4 years and a majority nothing could touch, and a plan that had sat in plain view for the best part of 5 years could finally be carried out. She had not always been able to do this. She remembered 1981 exactly. The National Coal Board had announced a first round of pit closures. The miners had threatened to strike, and her government had folded, offered concessions, and pulled the closures. The press called it a climb down, and in a sense it was, but it was also something else. The coal stockpiles at that moment were 6 weeks deep, and you cannot win a strike that runs through winter on 6 weeks of coal. So she had retreated, and while she retreated, she had built. By the spring of 1984, 57 million tons of coal sat stacked at power stations across the country, enough to keep the national grid running for more than a year without a single fresh ton being cut. She had the plan. She had the mountain of coal. Now she needed one more thing. A man who would do what had to be done and feel nothing while he did it. The man she had in mind was in New York, 67 years old, and had spent his whole working life in America. Ian MacGregor was a senior partner at the bank Lazare Frères and the former chief executive of Amax, one of the largest mining concerns in the United States. He had never run a British company in his life. And that was the point. He had grown up in Kinlochleven, a highland village that existed for one reason, an aluminium smelter. And when the economics of the smelter shifted, the reason for the village shifted with it. He had watched that happen up close as a young man and never once questioned whether it should. The government agreed to pay Lazard as much as £1.8 million, a fee and a set of bonuses, paid not to MacGregor but to his bank. Read that back slowly. The British taxpayer was paying an American investment bank to lend it to the man who would decide the fate of British mining towns. To MacGregor, every works and every pit was a financial unit with one question attached to it. Did it clear the line, or did it not? A steelworks assembled across 4 generations was a cost per ton figure. A community was background. He carried no relationship with the unions, no reverence for the post-war consensus, no instinct that some things simply could not be done. She did not hire him in spite of that. She hired him because of it. MacGregor did not arrive to a settled industry and light the fire. He arrived to a country already burning. Geoffrey Howe was her chancellor, and his medicine was pure monetarism. Interest rates climbed to 17%. The pound surged, and British exports became unaffordable almost overnight. In 1981, 364 economists signed an open letter to the Times warning the policy would deepen the slump and speed the hollowing out of industry. Howe did not shift an inch. Between 1979 and 1981, British manufacturing output fell by 15%. 3 million people were out of work by early 1982. The factories were closing because the pound was too strong, not because the pickets were too many. The demolition was well underway before MacGregor shut a single gate, go to Consett in County Durham, and stand where the works stood. The Consett Iron Company had been making steel on that hillside since 1840. 140 years, through 2 world wars, through the Depression, through nationalization. It was not merely the largest employer in the town. It was the reason the town was there at all. 25,000 people, and no other significant work within 30 miles in any direction. Walk on to the morning shift in 1975, and the heat finds you first, 40 feet from the furnace doors. Not warmth, but heat. The kind that tightens the skin across your face before your mind has named the sensation. The air carries iron and sulfur and something older underneath. The mineral breath of rock pressed in the dark for 300 million years and now on fire. 3,700 men worked there. The knowledge inside those jobs had been laid down over generations and handed from one man to the next, the sort you cannot buy in and cannot rebuild once it has walked out of the gate for the last time. On the 12th of September 1980, the furnaces went cold. Not wound down, closed. On a spreadsheet, the case for shutting Consett was watertight, and I do not think it is honest to pretend otherwise. What the spreadsheet could not price was what a town loses when its single reason for existing is switched off. There was no retraining. There was no transition fund. 3,700 families were left to absorb a blow the government's own papers had known was coming. Within a year, unemployment in Consett hit 35%, among the highest anywhere in Western Europe. MacGregor left British Steel in 1983, and Thatcher handed him the chairmanship of the National Coal Board and turned the same logic on a new set of towns. The steelworkers had taken it. They had gone quietly in the end. The miners would not, and she had been ready for them for 6 years. In March 1984, the Coal Board announced the closure of Cortonwood Colliery in Yorkshire. 5 weeks' notice. at a pit whose men had already lived through this once. Then came the wider figure, 20 pits, 20,000 jobs. He had not been brought in to run a coal industry, he had been brought in to end one. Scargill called a strike, and he did not hold a national ballot, because he knew a ballot risked losing Nottinghamshire 30,000 miners in profitable pits who might well decline to walk out. So he built a strike with no democratic mandate underneath it, and the power stations sat on their mountain of coal, and the lights, whatever happened now, were not going to go out. The confrontation came at Orgreave. The miners arrived before dawn, some having driven through the night from Yorkshire, from South Wales, from Scotland, and by 8 in the morning 5,000 men stood in a field in the South Yorkshire sun. This was the fight Thatcher had been preparing for since 1977. They had chosen the coking plant that fed the steelworks at Grimethorpe. Block it, choke the steel, multiply the pressure. Saltley Gate logic, replayed a dozen years on. But the National Reporting Centre, the very body set up after Saltley Gate to make sure another Saltley Gate could never happen, had drawn officers from forces the length of the country. This was a national operation, planned, rehearsed, funded, and signed off from the very top. The police shields began to beat in rhythm. Then the horses moved. The charge came in waves, mounted officers driving deep into the crowd, splitting the lines, and behind them the snatch squads, taking the men who could not get clear. 95 were arrested and charged with riot, an offence that carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The cameras that evening filmed from behind the police lines, and the footage that went out showed miners hurling stones before the charge. Later, analysis established the sequence had, in fact, run the other way. The charge came first. The riot trials collapsed when it emerged that South Yorkshire Police had coordinated their witness statements. Every defendant was acquitted. Not one officer was ever prosecuted. The men in that field were following a plan somebody had written in 1977, and she was the one who had commissioned it, and she had waited 6 years for that morning. The courts ruled the strike unlawful in September 1984, and the union's assets were exposed to sequestration, the strike fund, the reserves, everything stripped away through the machinery of the law. The trap closed on its own, and she never had to fire a shot, because in the end, Scargill handed her the weapon himself. In July 1984, speaking in private to the Conservative backbenchers of the 1922 committee, she gave the thing she believed she was fighting a name: the enemy within. A year earlier, the enemy had been a junta across an ocean. Now it was her own people, the men standing in that field. And what the strike meant inside their houses was this: no wages, no lawful strike pay, and a state that automatically docked £15 a week from a striking family's benefits on the assumption that the union must be making up the difference, even when sequestration meant there was nothing there to make up. What those communities managed to raise regardless is one of the extraordinary things in the whole story. The women against pit closures organised what the union could not: soup kitchens run out of welfare halls and church rooms across the coalfields, letters going out to unions in France and Belgium and Germany and Australia, other countries' miners sending money because they understood exactly what they were looking at. That December, Christmas parcels for the children were made up from those donations and carried out across the coalfields, and without them, across great stretches of Yorkshire, there would have been no Christmas at all. The Nottinghamshire wound cut a different way, and it is the part I found I could not put down. 30,000 miners in pits that were making money, never given a ballot, chose not to strike. A striking miner and a working miner, 3 doors apart on the same street, the same school for their children, the same pub on a Friday, and after that spring they no longer spoke. Those fractures did not close when the strike ended. Some are still there now, 40 years on, in the way certain families in certain streets still do not talk to certain other families. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. The Nottinghamshire men were not wrong. Their pits were profitable. They had been handed no democratic mandate for a walkout. They were defending their own livelihoods in the only rational way left open to them, and they are the ones history has judged most harshly of all. That is what happens when a dispute is designed from the outset to divide. The man on the right side of the picket line and the man on the wrong side of it turn out, in the end, to be casualties of the same plan. This was never only Thatcher, and it was never only Scargill, and anyone who tells you it was one man's doing is selling you a simpler story than the truth. There was bad government in it, and bad management, and a union leadership that led its own people into a battle it had already lost the day it chose not to ballot them. The men in the field paid for all three. By November 1984, the drift back began. Dozens and then hundreds, the morning news reporting the numbers with a clinical flatness. 300 returned yesterday, 400 the day before. The union's money was gone. The conversations grew shorter and the silences longer. On the 3rd of March 1985, the union voted to go back to work. 362 days, and not a single concession won, not one line of agreement. In South Wales, the last coalfield to return, the whole community walked back in together on that final morning, every man still out, the lodge banner carried at the front because somebody had decided that was the dignified way to do it. They walked in silence. There was nothing left to say. The pit was going to close, and every one of them knew it, and they walked in anyway. Scargill called it an organized retreat. The men who had spent a year not eating properly called it something plainer. There had been 174 working collieries in Britain at the start of the strike. By 1990 there were fewer than 65, and on the 27th of October 1986, in the middle of it all, her government carried out the Big Bang, the deregulation of the London Stock Exchange, and threw the city open to the money of the world. Britain's future was to be finance, not manufacturing. London, not Leeds. The city, not Consett. Throughout the strike, Scargill had waved a piece of paper at his press conferences, a list of pits he said were marked for closure, not 20 of them, but all of them. MacGregor called that absolutely untrue. Fleet Street called it paranoid fantasy. In 2014, Cabinet papers released under the 30-year rule confirmed exactly what MacGregor had denied in writing, and the newspapers had laughed off. Half the entire industry gone inside a single parliament. The list Scargill held up was not a delusion. It was a leak. He had been right about the scale, right about the intention, right about everything except how it might be stopped. And if you want to see what all of this did to the towns it fell on, the places ordered to shrink and the industries left to die on the spreadsheet, those films are already here on this channel, and they are where this story goes next. 4 years after the strike ended, Margaret Thatcher lost the country. The poll tax, a flat charge levied on each individual person in place of a rate based on the value of their property, was rolled out in Scotland in 1989 and in England in 1990. The Duchess in her mansion paid the same as the woman who cleaned it. 200,000 people marched on Trafalgar Square on the 31st of March 1990, and the largest riot central London had seen in over a century broke out at the gates of Downing Street. 491 arrests. By the autumn, 18 million Britons were simply refusing to pay. On the 1st of November, her Deputy Prime Minister Geoffrey Howe, the most loyal man she had, resigned. His resignation speech in the Commons 12 days later remains the most devastating thing ever said against a sitting Prime Minister in the history of that chamber. The day after, Michael Heseltine moved against her for the leadership. On the 22nd of November 1990, after 11.5 years, Margaret Thatcher resigned. The same instinct that had told her to break the miners had told her to press ahead with the poll tax. The first won her 3 elections. The second ended her in 19 months. The country she handed on was unrecognizable from the one she had walked into. Inflation tamed, the pound steady, the unions broken. The state pulled back out of steelworks and car plants and telephone exchanges and gas pipes and water, and the City of London growing faster than anything else in the economy. Her successor, John Major, inherited all of it, and inherited too the recession of 1991, which cut deeper than anyone had expected, and then Black Wednesday in September 1992, when sterling was thrown out of the European exchange rate mechanism, and interest rates were raised twice in a single afternoon before the government gave up trying to hold the line. When Tony Blair walked through the door of Number 10 in 1997, the expectation was that he would take her settlement apart. He did no such thing. New Labour kept nearly all of it. The privatisations stayed private. The union laws stayed on the books. The independence of the Bank of England granted within days of the new government. Taking office handed monetary policy for good to the financial sector she had unchained. The economic architecture was hers, and Blair chose to live inside it. For a decade, it appeared to be working. By 2007, the City of London was the largest financial centre on earth, larger than New York, and the economy, on the official figures, was the strongest it had been in 50 years. Then, in September 2008, the machine broke. Lehman Brothers collapsed in New York, and within 10 days, 3 of Britain's biggest banks, Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds, and HBOS, were minutes from failing. The government bought them. The cost to the taxpayer ran, in guarantees and loans and outright purchases, to something like £1.1 trillion. The recession that followed was the deepest since the 1930s. Real wages did not climb back to their 2008 level until the year 2024, 16 years lost. By 2025, independent analysis had concluded that if the growth of the pre-crash years had simply continued, the average British worker would be earning something close to a third more than they actually take home. In 2010, austerity began, and local council budgets were cut by 40% across a decade, and the libraries closed, and the courts closed, and the youth clubs closed. In June 2016, the country voted to leave the European Union by 52 to 48, and the strongest votes to leave came from the very regions she had stripped of their industry in the 1980s. The decade since has been one long emergency without a pause. Brexit, then a pandemic, then a war in Europe, then the sharpest inflation since her own era, 5 prime ministers in 7 years, and underneath all of it a slower collapse that never made a headline. By early 2026, 9.1 million working-age adults stood outside the labour market, 1 in 5. 2.8 million were economically inactive through long-term illness, 800,000 more than in 2019. The hospital list at 7.2 million. Public debt at 95% of national income, the highest since the early 1960s, and public trust in government at the lowest point ever recorded. By 2025, 2/3 of the country believed it was being torn apart by culture wars, up from less than half only 5 years before. Some of that is the direct result of choices Margaret Thatcher made. Some of it is the result of choices her successors made, and some of it has nothing whatever to do with her. Go to Grimethorpe in South Yorkshire, a pit village. The colliery closed in 1992, and by 1994 the settlement had been formally designated the most deprived in Britain. Go to Kellingley in the same county, where on the 18th of December 2015, the last deep coal mine in the country closed and the cage dropped for the final time. And the number of working deep mines in the United Kingdom became 0 and has stayed there. Male life expectancy in the old coalfield communities of South Yorkshire is still measurably below the national average, and that is not a historical curiosity. It is a living consequence being lived now by men who are alive now. Go back to Consett, drive up the hill into Durham, and stand where the steel came out of the ground. There is a retail park. There is a leisure centre. There is a monument, as though the whole thing were already settled history, safely behind us, when the truth is that it is still being paid for. Margaret Thatcher told the country in 1987 that there was no such thing as society, and the country boiled her down to 7 words and never once argued with the rest of it. And here is where the honest accounting has to be done, because it does not fall neatly on one side. Some of what she predicted has come to pass more or less exactly as she described it. The dependency she warned about has hardened across whole generations. The pulling apart of family and neighborhood she foresaw has happened on a scale that would have startled even her. The high street, she said, could not survive on top of an unproductive economy, did not survive. She was not wrong about all of it, but some of what she did left the country poorer than it needed to be. The towns of Consett and Grimethorpe and Mardy were not the unavoidable casualties of an economic law of nature. Germany went through the very same transition and did not gut its towns to do it. The old steel and coal towns of the Ruhr are still standing. Britain made a different choice, and the financial sector she flung open in 1986 made London the wealthiest city in Europe and turned the rest of the country into an afterthought. And then there is the third thing, the part the country never honestly reckoned with at all. The whole of that 1,000-word answer, the section about obligations rather than only entitlements, about what people owe as well as what they are owed, was never the version anyone argued over. The slogan stuck. The argument never happened. 39 years on, the country is still living inside the consequences of a question it never finished asking. Whether she was right or wrong about Britain depends entirely on which Britain you mean, the one in Consett or the one in the city, the one in that magazine answer or the one outside your own window in 2026. In July 2024, the country elected a government with the largest majority in 27 years, on the lowest share of the vote any post-war government has ever won it with, and Keir Starmer walked into the same building and inherited the same problem every Prime Minister since 2008 has inherited. The same question is still sitting on the desk. She warned us. She was right about some of it. She was wrong about some of it. And the rest of it we're going to have to work out for ourselves. Stand on that hill above Consett, where 25,000 people once lived off a single fire on a Durham hillside. Close your eyes. Feel the heat reaching out from the furnace doors before you are near them. The iron and the sulphur in the back of the throat. 3,700 men on the morning shift, and the knowledge in their hands that no accountant ever learned to price. A town that was there for one reason, doing the one thing it existed to do. Now open your eyes. A retail park, a leisure centre, a monument as if it were over. And if you want to understand what became of the country these fires once built, the cities that were told on paper to shrink themselves, and the great industries that Britain, in the end, chose to let go, those stories are already here on this channel, waiting for you now. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.